For a long time, cities have been made on the basis of organising buildings themselves into groups that form great walls or great chunks that then surround gardens, such that the gardens become the centre of activity and the prospect for the surrounding buildings. We're now in a time, in a suburban period, where we tend to put the building in the middle of the landscape and then speculate from there. Comparative to a life of a city and even the life of a designer, I've only been musing on these thoughts for 30 years, and I thought I would tell 10 small stories to try and be clear about something that is quite difficult to describe. Our first example involves a suburban house. As we know, and we were particularly reminded at the moment, houses need to perform a lot of roles apart from how they serve during the family cycle. In this first example, and please excuse the plan, we'll only have one to look at. A number of rooms in the house were organised so that they were very multiple in purpose. They were gathered along a promenade, and the promenade then projected into a new green square at the rear, so that the existing house had spent a long period as an object in the surrounding landscape. And then we made another setting for it, which is not so much a landscape as actually much more of a garden and even partly a square, to the extent that it has the circulation and various vantage points on its edges. Times in the house have been precarious as the household has shifted over the time, but the garden persists. In another story, after being asked to make a house that would last to 100 years, and having to take great care, therefore, about how the plan could remain without having to be reorganised, we didn't touch the earth lightly. We refashioned a hillside so that it had large platforms that could be utilised and so that we could capture a lot of water. Over time, the purpose for making these platforms, which is they might then be the persisting and memorable aspect of the site rather than the building itself, is becoming clearer. A central platform, in effect a garden, organises the rooms and is of course the setting for all the things that are so vital in a life but which are so hard to imagine in a brief. It's at this place that the events of life, like the events that happen in a city, are included in the place. And this instance, we're 25 years down, and we have 75 years to go. At the State Library of Queensland, which we redeveloped, it took some time to persuade that such an august institution would benefit if it had gardens. It had spent 20 years as a very severe block, very detached from the ground. We added many fragments and layers to it, and then so doing, using the tools of garden making, of making pathways and terraces and grottos. We've made sites for occasions that are perhaps unlibrary-like, but which do help the library become a miniature city. And part of that city includes a place, particularly for Indigenous people, where we're reminded that a huge part of their thinking about time is using occasions to gather, in this case around a fire. In the Longhouse story, time had to be spent being ruthlessly rational about how to make infrastructure which would eventuate to make a garden. A large container that protects from the vicissitudes of the landscape also harvests an enormous amount of water. Within that enclosure, a place that's protected enough for both people and plants, a village has been established with separate buildings, some of them larger, some of them smaller, many of them multiple in how they're used. At first, the infrastructure, of course, is bald as it's starting to do its work. But over time, that initiating piece of rationalism has amounted to a setting where romance can now flourish. At the Hobart Showgrounds, there was a moment to capture and change a piece of 200-year history, since it is a very sustainable thought to utilise spaces that we already have in the city in preference to expanding the city. The site is as large as the Hobart CBD. We've reordered it with 3 types of garden, a massive arena for multiple functions, vegetable growing gardens, and a central protected courtyard. In this way, we've been able to intensify not just the use, but the amount of occasions. So instead of the site serving just once a year, it can now hopefully serve as the host for occasions at least once a week. And in that way, it becomes civic, since we expect of our cities, however tiny, that it's the life in the place, rather than the look of it, that will make for civitas. And the central court that we're currently making plays a historic role of being both protective and condensing. So we'll have a public square and it'll be modelled on a garden. In this experiment on a suburban site, reminded that a lot of people in cities are single, but that is very human to need a lot of interactions, and even as one becomes older, in fact, being able to interact becomes even more vital. We had an elder, single lady. Elder ladies are a very favourite group, who lived alone in a family house on the same size site. We made 2 houses, for want of a better word, each with long arcades linking front garden to back garden. Along the arcades are then various addresses. This enables living and working and long stay guests and projects, and an amount of contact with the world that vastly exceeded that of what an originating suburban house could provide. The arcades end in gardens, and each garden has its own tiny building. In this case, the pair of gardens are only 14 months old. And it's imagined how over time that they might play their part in not only hosting life, but in overwhelming the presence of the building. In making an office building, we're reminded about how quickly power can be exercised. With 10 years of planning and constructing, we made a 30,000 square metre space. It was like a pair of pavilions amongst the other government pavilions on the gardens that descended to the rivers, to the river edge. The terraced gardens on the escarpment of the city turned out to have only been of service for 20 years, since 5 years ago, after a 20-year life, the building was removed, so that the time spent in a setting where the office building, which we can hardly see there beside the other pavilions that attach to the street, is being replaced by another idea of government, which will only take 5 years, in fact, to procure. The upside, when there's power and when there's an idea, it can move quickly. Perhaps thinking of cities as a garden is a way of trying to harness some of that power. Making an enormous laboratory building, which is also contains a pharmaceutical factory and medicine teaching facilities and all sorts of functions that are not thought to be garden applicable, the necessary building is unfortunately immense and lodged into an industrial site, which is itself a hospital. So we have a very industrial idea of health, but the opportunity of making a small gesture that would make a difference to that entire campus. By threading the linkages into a captured garden within the large TRI scheme, a place has been made that not only enables people to connect and pass through it 24/7, but to host events and, in a sense, to be the prompts for how our biomedical futures might be imagined. In that way, hopefully we're reminded that even in a highly technical building in the midst of industry, wandering through a garden on the way somewhere is a legitimate way of making part of town. In another small suburban project, we see that action of over and overness of time, garden after garden. An initial suburban house had served for 30 years. It was trimmed up so that we could make 2 gardens, and on the second garden is another building. That meant that the lady of the site, who had spent 30 years, instead of being moved into another community, were able to keep her in her streetscape and move the way the gardens work instead. So the second garden served for 10 years. It takes time for things to settle and become part of life. And then in that over and overness, it moved into becoming a forest. The enchanting thing to imagine here is that, of course, by making a forest, all the rooms that surround it are completely changed. And finally, in another small building, made for someone who has plenty of time, we observed all the conventions of making the house multiply usable with multiple addresses. We fashioned it so it could fit onto a hillside, and that being with the garden could be brought into very close proximity to life. Part of the hill is actually captured in the middle of the building. And a piece of imagining I had done about whether a life spent gazing at a view was perhaps going to fade if there was an offer of how to make and be with a garden, turned out to be a useful judgment, as the client, without any previous inclination, became a gardener. Amongst the garden terraces and amongst sort of the abstractions of the garden, this one being a rocky terrace with various crystals above and a site for occasions below. As part of the way that the building then was included in its community, the enthusiasm for garden making became contagious. And what was made on the inside then started to be expanded out into the surrounding street. So with enough time, moment by moment, the garden in the miniature city developed, and the love and sensibility for it developed. And so it's just a closing thought that a way of thinking about our planet, moment by moment, is to think of it garden by garden.